Is there then what hope is there for the Palestinians, for supporters of the Palestinians, that there will be even the most minute change in US foreign policy? Shall we just assume that this is how it's going to be?
It's been ongoing for quite some time now, the tit for tat between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The thing is, whoever comes to the US presidency, and I've said it several times in the past, it will not change the US foreign policy towards how they see the world, how they interact with the world, and how they support the Israeli entity against the world. So the ones that we know that were hit for a fact, but the Israelis are not talking about it, is the deputy chief of the Mossad. And he's in critical condition until now. He has other soldiers who were actually injured and killed with him, officers mainly.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and who you are. I'm Zarrar Khuhro, and I'm joined here today by Leila Hatoum, a Lebanese journalist and the editor-in-chief of MENA Uncensored. And we've got a lot of ground to cover, Leila, so I'm going to get right to it. We're going to start with the US presidential debate, which I think most of us saw, and even if we didn't have the stomach to sit through the entire thing, we've definitely seen clips and we've seen the discourse surrounding it. And what's striking to me, it shouldn't be, but it still is that these are two people, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, who disagree on everything. I mean, you name it, they're on different sides of it. Except, of course, when the mention of Israel comes up. And then we see this competition between the two of them to try and show everyone else in the whole world who can write the better blank check for Israel and who can better support Israel's genocidal actions in Palestine. So from a regional perspective, from a Palestinian perspective, and if we take the entire Middle East region as a whole, does it really matter in terms of Israel policy and in terms of the policy on Palestine? Does it really matter who wins?
First of all, thank you so much for having me back on your show. It's always a pleasure to have discussions with you because I don't consider them as talk shows, more like basically discussions between two friends. And yes, we've all heard the show business that happened over the past period. It wasn't only basically, let's say, yesterday or the day before. It's been ongoing for quite some time now, the tit for tat between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The thing is, whoever comes to the US presidency, and I've said it several times in the past, it will not change the US foreign policy towards how they see the world, how they interact with the world, and how they support the Israeli entity against the world. They will continue to give impunity to the Israeli entity, no matter what kind of crimes it commits, war crimes. Genocide is ongoing. It's being live streamed at the moment. And nobody cares about that in the US because everybody cares about what Donald Trump says about Kamala Harris and how the backbiting will happen from the other side, basically, or the other camp. So at the end of the day, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, they come to power, it will be the same foreign policy, continuing to support the Israeli entity, giving it impunity, banning anybody from going after it in courts of law, or be it resistance on the ground under international law. Everybody in Palestine and Lebanon have the right to, and even Syria have the right to go and pursue resistance by any means possible, including armed struggle against the Israeli entity. The Americans will go and support the Israeli entity, give it arms to fight that resistance. So the foreign policy, when it comes to presidency, completely two different separate things.
Yeah, so then is there any hope at all? Because I'm just going to backtrack a little bit now. In the past 10 months, right, when we first saw mass demonstrations in the West, and in particular in the United States, we saw the campus protests, we saw a lot of brave people standing up and speaking for Palestine at great personal cost. I mean, people were doxxed, people were forced out of their employment. It had a chilling effect. And at that point, a lot of us thought that, hey, maybe because it's supposed to be a democracy and, the people's voice is supposed to be heard, maybe this will affect a change in policy at some point going forward, even if it's minute. Now we see poll after poll, and I'm talking about the Democratic Party here, that most of the Democratic voters support a ceasefire. Some want to go further. Some want to talk about arms embargoes, or at least restricting arms sales to Israel. And the Israelis themselves admit that if it wasn't for the continuous supply of US weapons, they wouldn't have been able to fight beyond a couple of months. So, is there then what hope is there for the Palestinians, for supporters of the Palestinians, that there will be even the most minute change in US foreign policy? Shall we just assume that this is how it's going to be for all time to come?
Well, the way that I see it is with all these protests that happen on the ground, especially among the youth, the students of universities and high schoolers, the parents who are concerned about what's happening, they don't want to see more death and genocide happening across the world, because it will backfire also against the Americans. Wherever they go, they are now hated people because of the policies of their own government. So the change will come. Those new generations that are protesting what's happening, the change will come, but it's going to be slow. We're not going to see it in the next 4 years during the next presidential term. At the end of the day, you have two large political powers fighting over the presidency in the US. I highly doubt that the world, or basically the US, at least the Americans, would vote for Jill Stein. That would be a change that we would see immediately. When people stand up to the system that's trying to force on them only one of two choices, and it's not even a choice because either choice is going to support genocide. If they vote Jill Stein, for example, we would be speaking about a change that's happening now that could change the narrative for the Palestinians and for the rest of the world as well, because the American presence, military presence and support is not only for the Israeli entity. They have military bases across the Middle East, and they're creating problems across the Middle East. Their best interest is to sell weapons, to create wars, to sell these weapons, to create tensions and conflicts, to secure new markets. So if at any point people stand up and they decide to reprimand the Democrats or the Republicans for their bad choices in the past, and they all or the majority of them vote for Jill Stein, we can speak about change. But in the next presidential term, which is the next 4 years, and the 4 years after that, I highly doubt that we'd see any change. The people are still being controlled by mass media, by money, and by the show business that their own people are giving them, their own people from the Democrats or the Republicans.
Well, in the last, that change is going to come far too late to save the Palestinians then, because in the last 10 months, the new estimates, I know that they've stopped the casualty clock at like 40,000, 45,000, but I think the reality is that you have hundreds of thousands dead in Gaza. And now, thanks to the blanket impunity given to Israel, given to Netanyahu in particular, we see that they're moving on to turning the West Bank into Gaza as well. So realistically, is there any way that you see this ending without the mass murder of the Palestinians, without further occupation of the West Bank? Because it seems that Israel is happily carrying on with its agenda, and no one, certainly not in the West, certainly not in the Middle East, among the Arab countries, we'll come to Iran and Hezbollah in a while, is willing to stop them. So is it as difficult as it may be for a lot of us, for myself and for yourself, is it a done deal that the Palestinians will now simply just be exterminated while the world watches?
Well, they've already been watching the world, watching them being exterminated and doing nothing. And I fear the day that we'll reach a place where they will be completely displaced out of Gaza, completely displaced out of the West Bank and kicked out to nearby countries like Jordan and Egypt. This is the Israeli plan since the beginning. If you remember, the Egyptians have said in the past that they were contacted or basically reached out to by the Israelis, telling them, if you take the Palestinians in Gaza and we give you this and that in exchange. And if you remember, the former president Hosni Mubarak spoke about it in public in an interview, and he said, I refused that. Netanyahu approached him. Netanyahu is still the prime minister of the Israeli entity until today. At the end of the day, I think it's a royalty because they haven't changed him since 1998. No matter what kind of elections happen, he goes and then he comes back. They're never able to get rid of him. So when it comes to the West Bank, I had said it last month before the escalation happened. I said the next phase will be the West Bank, and after that, it will be South Lebanon, the northern front, actually, the northern occupied Palestinian front. Why? Gaza is not the target. Gaza has been under siege for 15 years. Everything is under control over there. They can continue to keep it under control. Yes, you will have breaches, you will have acts of resistance, but at the end of the day, the mass population, I'm talking about 2.2 to 2.3 million people who were living under 15 years of total siege, they were in check most of the time. When it comes to the West Bank, it's open territory. The landscape in the West Bank is completely different than Gaza. Gaza is a flat area, 365 kilometers squared of flat areas. They don't have mountains. The West Bank is different. The terrain helps the resistance if the resistance decides to do an intifada, for example, but they're not that heavily armed as the resistance in Gaza proved, right? They're using Molotov cocktails in the West Bank. They're using light weapons, their own private guns. This is what they secure from the black market they find everywhere. However, it is still a far more dangerous terrain for the Israelis than Gaza. So what they needed to do is secure Gaza, take out all their battalions and keep one towards the end. And this is what they did. They destroyed most of Gaza. They have one Israeli battalion manning the situation at the moment. Yes, they're incurring losses, but when they turn their back to Gaza to face the West Bank, they will have kind of what you call a secured soft spot that they have managed to isolate away from what they're going to do next. Then they will attack the West Bank. When they finish with the West Bank, they will move to the hardest front, and that would be South Lebanon. Why? Because the resistance over there is the most armed among all of the resistance groups in the region. It's the most trained among all of the resistance groups in the region, and it's the only resistance in the region, aside from the Palestinians, of course, we're putting Palestinians on the side. It's the only resistance outside Palestine that knows the Israeli mentality, have fought against the Israelis and have won against the Israelis in the past, and managed to kick out the Israeli entity out of most of southern Lebanon. The Israelis didn't do it much elsewhere, except for in Gaza in 2005 and Lebanon in the year 2000. In 2006, the Israelis tried to do a retaliation against the Lebanese, and the Lebanese wiped the floor with them. They lost Merkava tanks, they lost soldiers. And they had to withdraw. I was covering that on the ground. The Israelis from the second week of the war were barking, asking the Americans to create what you call a term for a ceasefire. They wanted to pull back, but they couldn't, and the Americans told them, no, continue, and they continued to send them weapons via an air bridge. And they tested new weapons on us, the 2-ton bombs, the bunker busters. They tested everything you can think of on us. And we were the testing ground, the laboratory, before they went over and they created the attack, and now they're using them against the Palestinians in Gaza. So they perfect it on us, and then they use it against the Palestinians. So the way I see it, the escalation in the West Bank is going to continue, and it's been ongoing for the past 2.5 weeks. It's going to get more vicious. The Israelis will secure the Jordan Valley, the western bank of the river of Jordan, the Jordan River, and they will have the Jordanians secure the eastern side of the Jordan River. Why? The moment you close that soft spot towards the southeastern side of the Israeli entity, which is occupied Palestinian territories, then you can turn your back to everything that's happening in the south and look northwards towards the northern front, and you can fight over there. That front is really strong. They need the Americans to join them on that front. Once the escalation happens, the Americans will move in. That's why the Americans have their aircraft carriers, their military troops repositioned in the Middle East to support that.
Now, speaking of the northern front, I mean, as you say, once Gaza is dealt with, once the West Bank is dealt with, then all guns can be pointed to the north. But when we talk about escalation in the north, are you thinking in terms of increased airstrikes of the kind that Israel is doing, or are we talking in terms of an actual ground incursion into Lebanese territory? Because as you correctly put it, the last couple of times it didn't end very well for the Israelis. And all indications is that Hezbollah is now perhaps even more entrenched, even better trained and better armed than it was back then. So what would it take for Israel to make such an apocalyptic decision?
The Israelis have always banked on their air force as what we call the main support and backbone for any attack against Lebanon. Lebanon in the past never had air defense systems. The Lebanese army is weakly or poorly equipped. They don't have proper air defense systems, and we didn't have air defense systems as a resistance. So they used to have the upper hand when it came to an air blanket for their forces to advance. And still in the year 2006, it took them 6 days to be able to get into one of the border villages that we call border villages in Maroun al-Ras, when in fact back in 1967, it took them 6 days to take over 3 Arab countries. So that tells you one thing, fighting on the ground is really tough for the Israelis. They believe Lebanon is not theirs. I'm talking about the soldiers on the ground. The political leadership is a completely different thing. They sell people words. So we have recordings and clippings of soldiers crying, wanting to leave this country. It's like, we don't want to stay here, it's not ours. And soldiers dying over there. The Israelis pulling back, they're admitting defeat because they couldn't achieve any of their goals. If they do it again on the ground, they will lose. The difference this time is that the resistance has shown that it has accurate air defense systems. They've downed up to 7 drones so far. We're talking multiple types of drones, some of them who fly up to 35 to 40,000 feet. So we're talking a distance of a commercial flight or fighter jets. And this is not a joke for the Israeli military and the Israeli Air Force, because their fighter jets fly at that altitude as well. If they want to engage in an expanded war against Lebanon, that means any of their planes in the future could be downed over Lebanon. That means we will have another Ron Arad case. For those who don't know who Ron Arad is, he's an Israeli pilot who was shot over the Bekaa area by the Syrian air defense system, because the Syrian military was found in Lebanon at the time. And he was taken hostage. Until now, they don't know where he is. They have multi-million-dollar rewards for those who have information about him, and nobody knows where he is. Now, imagine if you have multiple Ron Arad cases in Lebanon. Ron Arad is the Israeli pilot whom nobody has seen, but they have clippings of him when he was pulled out of the plane and he was still alive. Ground invasion, they will lose. Yes, they will incur mass destruction against Lebanon. Nobody said that the Israelis are not going to destroy Lebanon or the infrastructure or kill Lebanese citizens. That has been their main target since the beginning. Destroying countries so that the countries would be busy for the next 10 years rebuilding and not focusing on what the Israeli entity is doing, the Israeli enemy. They will continue to target civilians because that's what they do best. They have zero ethics. The least moral, it's not the least, it's the immoral militia, it's not even an army in the world that's fighting on the ground, and it's being supported by the Western nations, including mainly NATO nations, US, UK, France, and others, and Germany. And they're enabling it to continue to kill and target civilians, civilian infrastructure, and civilian facilities. Whereas the resistance so far continues to only target Israeli military. Even the Israeli military are taking human shields and civilian shields when they're fighting against the Lebanese resistance. They're hiding in civilian homes in the Metula settlement, for example, in Kiryat Shmona and other places. So the resistance is following them with guided missiles. And there's a reason when you read the resistance statements, sometimes they say we've used Katyusha against this settlement. And sometimes you'd hear, against a military base. And sometimes you'd hear them saying, we used 2 guided missiles that hit a house accurately in the Metula settlement, for example. It's because they're following the soldiers into the homes that they are taking refuge in.
Now, that's Hezbollah, and we've seen that Hezbollah has also demonstrated capabilities of striking fairly deep inside Israel. I mean, perhaps for the first time, we've seen Israelis having to evacuate the northern settlements and so on. It has been now, I believe, over a month since the assassinations of Fawad Shukr in Beirut and Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And everyone was expecting something of a reaction from both parties. Now, Hezbollah did conduct limited strikes and then sort of called it a day. But it has been over a month and we have not seen any kind of retaliation or reaction from Iran. What do you think are the reasons behind that?
Hezbollah's reaction wasn't limited. They hit deep into the Israeli entity's terrain. They hit 110 kilometers away from the blue line. And it's only 1.5 kilometers from Tel Aviv. 1.5 kilometers. That means that it's the beating heart of the Israeli entity. And the Galilot military base that was hit, it has the Mossad HQ, and it has the department for the unit 8200, the one that's basically, we're going to call it the online Mossad. Yeah. Those are the ones who do espionage, and basically they run the Hasbara and they run everything else. They create the narratives that create sectarian fighting in the region, that creates division between the people of this region as well. So remember, electronic warfare is as important as, and media warfare is as important as warfare on the ground as well. They hit it. They've had a successful attack. The Israelis, until now, they're not telling anyone the number of injuries and casualties and who was killed in that attack. There was a speculation that the head of the 8200 unit was killed. On the same day, I had credible information behind enemy lines that it wasn't him. And I went out in his space and I said it was not the head of the 8200 unit. People still insisted on that. 2 weeks down the line, it turned out that this man is still alive and he wasn't hit. So the ones that we know that were hit for a fact, but the Israelis are not talking about it, is the deputy chief of the Mossad. And he's in critical condition until now. He has other soldiers who were actually injured and killed with him, officers mainly, and they're not talking about it because they took them to a military medical facility. There's no leak when it comes to military facilities. We can have the leak before or during the hit, but not when they take them to a military medical facility. Now, this is an attack that Hezbollah didn't call it a day. They said, Nasrallah, Hezbollah Secretary General, came out in a speech and said, we are going to assess the situation. We're going to gather intel and see what we hit and the extent of it. If we're happy with it, we're going to close that file. If we're not happy with it, the retaliation will have a phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4. He named that. In the meantime, there will continue to be a support front for Gaza by attracting most of the Israeli military power towards what you call the Northern Front. Now, when it comes to the Iranians, it's different. Iran sits at not a close proximity with the Israeli entity. Remember, we share direct borders with the de jure state of Palestine. The Iranians are about 1,500 kilometers away from Palestine. So whatever reaction they need to do, it will be seen by satellites. The Israelis will be ready for it. The Americans will help them down most of the missiles like we saw in the past. And unless the Iranians have somebody inside and they can carry out a major attack internally or from a surrounding nation, then that's different. But I highly doubt that they will do it from a different country because it happened on their territory. So their reply should be of the same caliber. They can easily assassinate, if they plan for it, assassinate one of the, let's say, the Israeli generals or politicians. But at the end of the day, they have to calculate it really well. You cannot carry out an attack without preparing for it. And if your enemy is ready, you cannot go and hit it when he's ready and waiting for you. You have to wait for when his guard is down and then you attack. It will take time, but during that time, what are the Israelis doing? They're waiting for the Iranians to attack. So they're always on their toes. And that's part of the psychological warfare that the Iranians are doing against the Israelis. This is what Hezbollah did against the Israelis. And this is what the Yemenis are currently doing against the Israelis, because there's also the third retaliation from the Yemenis. The Israelis hit Al-Hudaydah in Yemen, and the Yemenis vowed that they will retaliate and it will be harsher than the Hezbollah's retaliation. They said that to us. One of the colonists from Ansarullah, we hosted him in one of our spaces, and he said, the retaliation will be big, it is coming, let them wait for it. So the psychological warfare is there, and they're preparing for that hit. Now, it could be collective between them and the Iranians, or separately, that's different. Hezbollah carried out a separate attack. If they're not happy with the retaliation, phase 2 could be collective with the rest of the resistance, or it could be also unilateral.
Okay, now, just finally, I want to move a little bit towards Jordan. Recently, we saw, now we know, obviously, Egypt's been bought off. We've seen the attitude from Saudi, from the UAE. Coming to Jordan, now Jordan's position is somewhat unique among all of these nations, given, the titular status as guardians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We've seen what that's worth. And of course, given that there is a large Palestinian population in Jordan itself. And very recently at the Allenby Bridge, we saw one Jordanian truck driver conceal a weapon and shoot down 3 Israelis. After which, we saw countless people coming to condole at his father's house. We've seen protests. I've even seen videos of fireworks. I'm not sure if they're related to this event or not, but it seems to have been welcomed by the Jordanian people. The Jordanian government and the king, that's another story. But in what possible scenario does public pressure in Jordan become too great to withstand? Is that something that you think that the Jordanian leadership is worried about?
I've been to Jordan. I went to Jordan actually in January this year with activist Sarah Wilkinson and Yemen, trying to rally the Jordanians and the world to send food to North Gaza via airdrops, because airdrops at the time were being done by Jordan, but they only included medicine. And we spoke to activists on the ground. We took part in protests, monitoring how the people are reacting, and they all supported the Palestinian cause. There were at least 2 posts every Friday in 2 different squares supporting Palestine, supporting what's the Gazans against the genocide that was happening against them and continues to happen against them. So the Jordanian people in general are against the onslaught that the Israelis are committing against the Palestinians. The Jordanian government, on the other hand, they have, some people play politics, right? At the end of the day, what's the best interest of the country and how we can maintain our relationship with the countries that we have signed agreements with. Remember, they have normalized ties with the Israelis. How can we safeguard our country from also being attacked? We have people over there, we have businesses, money, it always filters down to money, right?
Yeah,
so
always.
They never cut ties with the Israeli entity. They never stopped the border crossings or anything else. The people were angry about that. That's why they were taking to the streets and protesting. If their government had taken a stand where they stopped their ties with the Israeli entity, the people would have been just protesting in front of the Israeli embassy and denouncing what's happening, also happy with what their government is doing. The government is kind of wary at the moment. They do understand that any possibility of them fighting the Israelis, there could be a coup from them supported by the Americans, Israelis. They walk on eggshells when it comes to this matter. There are 2 or 3 or 4 or even 10 and more who are trying to infiltrate to the other side. And it happened over the past few months. This is not the first incident where Jordanians try to attack the Israelis or infiltrate to the other side to fight. And this man with his little gun shooting down 3 Israeli policemen, security officers, not civilians. He shot and killed 3 security officers on occupied Palestinian territories. Person showed the whole anything. That's why his tribe, he comes from a very proud Bedouin tribe, the Hawaitat. His name is Maher Al-Jazi, but his tribe is Al-Hawaitat. So they held a massive funeral for him, and the rest of the tribes came in support and to congratulate his parents because they had a martyred son, because he went over to support a just cause and to support the people who are being massacred by the Israeli occupation. They're very proud of him. They're not going to delete those videos if it's true, where you said went fireworks. I haven't seen them, but if it's true, it's because they're proud of what he did. And remember this, the Jordanians are, because of this Al-Limbi bridge crossing incident, they started increasing their military presence along the eastern bank of the Jordan River in the Jordan Valley, and the Israelis took it as a chance and an excuse to increase their military presence in the Jordan Valley, which is currently, from the West Bank side, it's Palestinian. They have annexed in July 5 miles squared of the Jordan Valley, Palestinian territories for themselves. Now they're taking it as an excuse to take over military-wise and fortify it, so when they turn their back to the south and look northwards, that soft side, as we call it, will be secured not only by them, but also by their allies who are the Jordanian military.
So that's the situation there. And as we wait, all of us, for the tide to turn, it does seem that time is drastically running out for the people in Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank. Leila Hatoum, thank you so much. Pleasure as always. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much for your time. Pleasure is all mine.